crash tore through the night sky over Belgorod, a city that had until that moment believed itself safely behind Russian lines. Within minutes, 500,000 residents were swallowed by a wall of darkness. Streetlights failed, substations erupted, and what Moscow called a temporary grid anomaly was in truth a high-precision Ukrainian strike executed with digital choreography unseen in this war. The attack was not merely destruction, it was a message, one that echoed from the Dnipro to NATO's eastern flank power. Both electrical and symbolic can be switched off in seconds. According to Defense News and Reuters reports in early October 2025, the strike was conducted amid Ukraine's Deep Strike Initiative, a campaign designed to paralyze Russian infrastructure supporting frontline operations. The chosen target, Belgorod's main thermal power plant, wasn't random. Analysts described it as a nerve center for both civilian and military energy distribution. Satellite imagery reviewed by BBC Verify later confirmed damage patterns consistent with Himars precision rockets striking transformer nodes and control buildings. What makes this attack so remarkable is its hybrid nature. It combined cyber interference, electronic deception, and coordinated kinetic fire, a model of warfare reminiscent of NATO's airland battle concept, but modernized through real-time AI-assisted targeting. Western defense experts say the operation likely began hours earlier, with drone decoys and false radar signatures flooding Russia's S-300 and S-400 networks. DW military correspondent Thomas Wiegold noted that the brilliance wasn't in the rocket, it was in the algorithm that told it when to fly. For Russia, the psychological impact was immediate. Emergency sirens, failed communication grids jammed, and commanders scrambled to reroute power to military hubs. In Moscow, official statements avoided the word Himars, calling it a terrorist act. Yet Western intelligence officials quietly confirmed that this strike was one of the most surgically executed energy attacks since the Gulf War. The shockwaves reached beyond Russia's borders. Poland, Estonia, and Germany reportedly increased cyber defense alerts, fearing retaliatory digital strikes. Could this be the dawn of a new kind of warfare where electricity becomes both target and weapon? The question looms large as nations reassess what critical infrastructure truly means. In the span of one night, Ukraine demonstrated that battlefield superiority isn't just about tanks or troops, it's about knowing how to make an entire city blink. As Belgorod reeled in darkness, the real genius of the operation unfolded high above the clouds. It wasn't brute firepower that broke Russia's defenses. It was the art of saturation, precision, and deception blended into one. Hours before the main strike, the skies over Kursk, Bryansk, and Voronezh were filled with a chaotic swarm of unmanned aerial vehicles, some no larger than a suitcase, others carrying decoy transponders that mimicked cruise missile signatures. It was a blinding symphony designed to make Russian radar operators doubt their own eyes. Defense analysts from Jane's Defense Weekly later confirmed that over 80 drones were launched in coordinated waves, forcing Russia's layered air defense systems, S-300s, S-400s, and the short-range Panzer units to split their tracking and exhaust precious interceptors. The tactic was straight out of NATO's playbook Overload, confuse and collapse the decision loop, said former U.S. Air Force electronic warfare specialist Lieutenant Colonel Mark Hastings in an interview with Reuters. When the Russians reacted to one threat, they exposed themselves to another. The saturation wasn't limited to the air. Cyber units embedded within Ukraine's Defense Intelligence Directorate reportedly initiated a ghost ping campaign injecting false telemetry data into Russian radar grids and communications relays. The result, by the time the real Himars launch sequence began, Russian command believed they were repelling a major drone attack in the south. The northern grid over Belgorod was ironically left half blind and undermanned. According to DW sources, each Himars system used was equipped with the latest M31A2 rockets, modified with multispectral seekers. These rockets could detect electromagnetic emissions from the grid infrastructure itself, allowing them to home in on live transformers or relay nodes, effectively listening for their targets. The strike teams operating from within Ukraine's Kharkiv region fired during a 90-second radar lull detected by American reconnaissance satellites. That window, described by one NATO officer as a digital eclipse, was the difference between failure and history. The Russian military, long proud of its integrated air defense network, found itself overwhelmed by noise. Dozens of interceptors were fired into the void. Some even collided mid-air as competing units attempted to engage phantom targets. The precision of Ukraine's orchestration was chilling, like watching a conductor manipulate an enemy's instruments until they played against themselves. When the real missiles arrived, they were ghosts in the data stream, unannounced, undetected, unstoppable. Within seconds, the Himars salvos struck key converter substations and grid control buildings. The explosions didn't just cut power, they triggered cascading surges that melted copper lines and fried emergency relays. By dawn, Belgorod's skyline glowed only from the fires below. Can a swarm of small drones really blind one of the world's largest air defense networks? This question, asked now across think tanks from Brussels to Washington, redefines the balance between quantity and quality in modern warfare. What once required a fleet of bombers can now be achieved by an orchestra of micro-drones, algorithms, and precision-guided rockets, a haunting glimpse into tomorrow's wars. As the drone deception forced Russia's defenses into chaos, the true execution phase began a choreography of speed, silence, and precision that Western observers have already labeled a textbook strike. The Himars units positioned in eastern Kharkiv under camouflage nets waited for confirmation from orbital assets. When the encrypted signal arrived, relayed through the Pentagon's Sentinel-Net satellite network, and verified by Ukraine's new AI-assisted targeting suite, Perun, the rockets launched in a staggered pattern. Each carried a 90-kilogram high-explosive warhead programmed for impact within a 10-meter accuracy radius. At exactly 02:14 local time, the first rocket struck Belgorod's main thermal plant, hitting the southern transformer array. Witnesses described the explosion as a pulse of daylight. Within 5 seconds, a secondary detonation followed as stored turbine fuel ignited, sending shockwaves through the industrial quarter. Reuters analysts reviewing the blast pattern later confirmed at least 4 distinct impact craters consistent with Himars' guided trajectory correction using GPS and inertial navigation integration. But the brilliance of the operation went beyond hitting targets. It was about how those targets were chosen. According to Defense News, the strike planners had identified Belgorod's energy complex as a grid node of nodes responsible for balancing output between civilian zones and 3 critical military installations, including a radar relay and an ammunition plant 15 kilometers away. Destroying the control center didn't just black out lights, it severed synchronization between multiple substations, causing chain reactions far beyond the visible explosions. Experts from The Guardian reported that within 6 minutes, $480,000 households lost power along with 22 military logistics hubs. Railway signaling systems froze. Air defense radar coverage dipped by nearly 40% in the Belgorod-Kursk corridor. This wasn't just a strike, it was an act of digital engineering, said Dr. Ian Latham, a British cyber warfare specialist at King's College London. They didn't destroy the grid, they rewired it into silence. On social media, residents uploaded haunting videos of blacked out streets, interrupted only by flashes of emergency flares and anti-air tracers. Yet for Ukraine's command, this was not about spectacle, it was about leverage. By demonstrating precision deep inside Russian territory, without mass civilian casualties, Kyiv proved that Western-supplied Himars systems could achieve strategic paralysis while staying within the rules of proportional warfare. A principle President Donald Trump praised publicly, calling it a demonstration of what discipline and American technology can achieve. The Russian Ministry of Defense responded with fury, claiming over 20 missiles were intercepted, a figure contradicted by satellite heat signatures showing only 4 mid-air explosions, likely failed intercepts. President Putin held an emergency meeting in Moscow, accusing NATO of directly aiding the strike through orbital surveillance. Still, Western intelligence sources confirmed that while U.S. reconnaissance provided general situational data, Ukraine's tactical execution was entirely autonomous. By dawn, Belgorod's power plant was no longer operational. Smoke rose in slow spirals as fire teams battled the blaze. The symbolic effect was devastating a city within Russia's borders, powered by its own grid, silenced by Western precision systems, adapted by Ukrainian engineers. It was a statement technology, not territory, now defines the front line. Could this strike become a blueprint for future hybrid wars, where infrastructure replaces infantry as the prime target? The question now dominates NATO's strategic forums as every modern military contemplates the chilling simplicity of turning power into pressure and silence into victory. The blackout that followed wasn't merely the absence of light, it was the unraveling of an entire command ecosystem. Within hours, Belgorod's regional command centers were operating in a communications vacuum. Military radios flickered with static rail networks ground to a halt, and fuel convoys stood immobilized under dead traffic lights. Russia's vast logistical machinery, the arteries feeding its front lines in Luhansk and Kursk, began to seize. According to DW's defense desk, the timing was deliberate. Himars impacts had not only struck the power plant, but also key fiber optic relays linking Belgorod to Western Russia's command and control C2 hubs. With those circuits destroyed, frontline units lost synchronized updates on drone surveillance ammunition flows and air defense coverage. It was a perfect strike on the nerve center, noted defense news analyst Howard Altman. Without energy and data, modern armies revert to the 20th century, slow, blind, and reactive. For Ukraine's intelligence network, this operation was proof that information warfare and kinetic precision could merge seamlessly. NATO monitoring stations in Poland reported that rail operations carrying artillery shells to Belgorod's depots halted for more than 17 hours. The impact rippled south, affecting replenishment cycles across the entire Belgorod-Donbas corridor. The Guardian cited a Western military source confirming that 2 Russian ammunition trains, each carrying over 200 tons of ordnance, were stranded in transit due to disabled switching systems. When power goes out, rails die, the source remarked bluntly. The disruption extended into the skies. Air defense coordination collapsed temporarily, forcing Russian pilots to abort sorties over Kharkiv's border zone. Thermal imaging collected by Jane's Intelligence Review revealed the temporary deactivation of at least 2 radar stations supporting the S-400 network. For a few crucial hours, Ukraine's reconnaissance drones roamed freely, mapping Russian artillery positions and updating digital fire grids that would fuel the next phase of strikes. But perhaps the most profound consequence was psychological. Belgorod's residents, accustomed to distant reports of war, suddenly faced its direct consequences. Hospitals switched to generators, supermarket refrigeration failed, and fuel rationing began within 12 hours. Social media platforms flooded with images of soldiers charging phones from car batteries, an unintended emblem of modern vulnerability. The attack didn't just shut down machines, it severed confidence in the state's promise of security. Inside Russia's Ministry of Energy emergency team scrambled to reroute power from secondary substations, while military engineers attempted to isolate the damaged grid to prevent feedback surges. However, Ukraine's strike had triggered a cascading effect. Protective relays tripped in neighboring regions, amplifying instability across the Southwest Energy Corridor. As one energy expert told Reuters, it was like pulling one thread and watching the entire tapestry fold. President Donald Trump, addressing reporters from the White House, stated that Ukraine's resilience and precision show what modern warfare looks like when brains lead the battle. His words underscored Washington's quiet satisfaction. America's long investment in precision warfare was now validating itself on the world stage. Strategically, the blackout shifted tempo. Russian field commanders were forced to reprioritize defense resources toward infrastructure protection, diluting their offensive capability. The illusion of control shattered. For the first time, Russia was defending its own energy lifelines with the same urgency it once used to attack Ukraine's. Can a single city's silence alter the course of a continental war? The answer, still unfolding, depends on whether Moscow can rebuild faster than Kyiv innovates a contest of circuits, code, and will. As daylight returned over Belgorod, the smoke still rising from the crippled power station painted a symbol of a larger truth: Russia's doctrine of deep defense had failed. For decades, Moscow's military planning revolved around the assumption that its homeland infrastructure was untouchable. But the Belgorod blackout shattered that illusion, leaving both civilians and soldiers facing the same uncertainty. If the lights could die in Belgorod, what about Kursk-Voronezh or Moscow itself? Western analysts described the strike as a turning point, not because of the scale of destruction, but because of the psychological and doctrinal shock it caused. It was as if the front line jumped 300 kilometers overnight, said Dr. Samuel Crenshaw, a strategic warfare expert at the Rand Corporation, in an interview with BBC World Service. It demonstrated that Russia's interior, once a sanctuary, is now part of the battlefield. The blow to morale was unmistakable. Russian telegram channels flooded with panicked messages from families of deployed soldiers who couldn't contact relatives due to the power outage. Hospitals postponed surgeries. Schools closed for safety reasons. What had begun as a tactical strike evolved into a crisis of confidence. The Kremlin issued stern warnings promising retaliatory precision operations, but few could ignore the symbolism. Russia, the world's largest energy exporter, was struggling to keep its own lights on. Meanwhile, Ukraine capitalized on this psychological disruption. By late October, officials from Kyiv confirmed a sharp decline in Russian artillery fire along the Kharkiv front, nearly 40% lower than the previous week, according to Defense News data compiled from NATO surveillance. The blackout had rippled through supply chains, reducing ammunition throughput and delaying the delivery of armored reinforcements. They were fighting logistics, not soldiers, remarked retired U.S. Army Colonel David Perkins, referencing the operational art behind Ukraine's strike. You don't win wars by destroying people, you win by disabling what they depend on. Russia's internal reaction exposed cracks within its own defense establishment. The Al Jazeera Moscow bureau reported quiet frustration among mid-level commanders who criticized outdated contingency systems and an over-reliance on centralized power grids. Attempts to mobilize auxiliary diesel generators faltered. Some units discovered that maintenance funds had been diverted or misused. It was corruption meeting precision warfare, one European intelligence officer commented anonymously to The Guardian. The incident also jolted NATO's strategic calculus. If Ukraine's precision tactics could penetrate deep into Russia's infrastructure, could similar hybrid strikes threaten Western capitals in future conflicts? NATO command in Brussels convened an emergency working group to study defensive energy resilience, exploring ways to decentralize grids, fortify digital control systems, and integrate autonomous power nodes. Belgorod may be a warning to everyone, DW analyst Udo Schmidt observed. The next wars will not only be fought over territory, but over the electrons that power it. For Russia, rebuilding Belgorod's grid became a race against time. Within a week, crews managed to restore partial power, but blackouts persisted intermittently. Economic analysts estimated the cost at over $2.4 billion, not including military losses. Yet beyond money or infrastructure, it was morale that suffered the deepest wound. Soldiers along the front, hearing of their family's hardship, reportedly showed declining combat motivation. Even pro-Kremlin media struggled to maintain the illusion of control. How does a nation fight when its citizens are living by candlelight? That is the question haunting the Kremlin tonight, a question Ukraine's strategists are in no hurry to let fade. The Belgorod strike may have lasted minutes, but its echoes will shape military doctrine for years. In Washington and Brussels, the event is now studied as a model for hybrid precision warfare, a fusion of drones, AI targeting, and long-range fires designed not to conquer land, but to paralyze systems. NATO strategists call it infrastructure attrition, where the battlefield extends into the veins of a nation's energy grid, transport network, and communications web. By mid-October 2025, U.S. intelligence assessments shared with Reuters and Defense News concluded that the Belgorod attack had reduced Russian regional operational efficiency by 60% for over a week, a result once achievable only through sustained bombing campaigns. The underlying principle, high-tech asymmetry. Ukraine didn't need massive arsenals, it needed intelligence timing and precision. This was algorithmic warfare, said Dr. Elaine McCarthy, senior researcher at the Atlantic Council. What we saw wasn't brute force, it was code meeting steel. In response, Moscow began reconfiguring its defensive doctrine. Russia's Ministry of Defense ordered the rapid deployment of mobile short-range air defense systems SHORAD to protect critical power sites. New camouflage networks and thermal decoys appeared near Kursk and Oriol. Yet Western analysts believe these are reactive measures, not proactive evolution. They're patching holes, not rewriting the book, commented Jane's Defense Weekly. The real challenge, experts say, lies in integrating redundancy, smaller distributed grids capable of surviving targeted precision attacks. Ukraine, meanwhile, has reportedly refined its dynamic strike matrix, a tactical system integrating satellite reconnaissance with AI-driven predictive modeling. This allows simultaneous cyber and kinetic attacks, effectively turning power networks into open battlefields. For NATO observers, this capability signals a profound shift. The line between civilian and military infrastructure is vanishing. Every generator, every data hub is now a potential weapon or target, DW analyst Michael Sturmer wrote. Strategically, the Belgorod blackout exposed a vulnerability extending beyond Russia. European defense planners are re-examining their own dependence on centralized grids, particularly amid growing concerns of Chinese cyber espionage and Iranian drone proliferation. The US under President Donald Trump has publicly praised Ukraine's ingenuity, but quietly accelerated domestic energy defense integration programs under the Homeland Resilience Directive. Pentagon officials have also greenlit research into counter-AI systems aimed at detecting algorithmic saturation tactics like those used in Belgorod. As winter approaches, questions linger over escalation. Will Ukraine continue deep strike campaigns into Russia proper? Will Moscow retaliate with equivalent cyber offensives? Or will this event force both sides and the world to confront the reality that modern war is no longer fought on front lines, but through the invisible circuits that sustain them? One European intelligence officer summarized it succinctly in The Guardian: Belgorod wasn't the first blackout of this war, it was the first blackout of the next war. In the end, the battle for Belgorod was not about territory or glory, but about evolution. It marked the moment when data drones and precision fire replaced massed armor as the true arbiters of power. For Ukraine, it was proof that ingenuity could outmatch scale. For Russia, it was a warning written in darkness. And for the rest of the world, a haunting reminder that the next war might not begin with explosions, but with silence. The Belgorod blackout marked a defining moment in modern warfare, a strike that fused drones, cyber deception, and Himars precision into a single synchronized assault. Ukraine's operation demonstrated that victory no longer depends on territorial conquest, but on the ability to disable the opponent's infrastructure. The attack's success stemmed from the saturation of Russian air defenses through coordinated drone swarms, cyber infiltration, and AI-driven timing, leaving Belgorod defenseless when the rocket struck. Its aftermath extended far beyond the battlefield command paralysis logistic gridlock, and a collapse in civilian morale exposed Russia's dependence on centralized power. For NATO and the West, the operation signaled a new era where critical infrastructure becomes both weapon and target. As the United States and allies recalibrate defenses under President Donald Trump's directive, the world watches how far hybrid warfare will